Never accept jewelry from strangers in cemeteries. What sounds like common sense became a living nightmare for Mia, a young woman grieving her grandmother in Savannah, Georgia. One innocent act of kindness, accepting a silver ring from an old woman among the graves, opened a door to darkness she never knew existed. What followed was a descent into terror that nearly cost Mia her soul. This is her story, and by the end, you'll understand why some gifts should never be accepted. The Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, was a place where the living came to remember the dead. But on this particular October evening, as shadows stretched like skeletal fingers across the weathered headstones, it felt more like a place where the dead remembered the living. Mia Chen stood before her grandmother's grave, clutching a bouquet of white lilies that trembled in her hands. 1 year. It had been exactly 1 year since she'd lost the only person who truly understood her. The anniversary of her grandmother's death hit harder than she'd expected, like a wound that refused to heal no matter how much time passed. The cemetery was nearly empty, just as Mia had hoped. She'd timed her visit for late afternoon, when most visitors had gone home, and the fading light painted everything in shades of amber and gray. Spanish moss hung from the ancient oak trees like funeral veils, swaying gently in the humid breeze. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and something else, something older, heavier, like earth that had been disturbed and left to settle again. Mia knelt beside the granite headstone, tracing her grandmother's name with trembling fingers. Margaret Chen, beloved mother, grandmother, friend. The words felt inadequate, too small to contain the enormousness of who her grandmother had been. Margaret had raised Mia after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8 years old. For 15 years, her grandmother had been her entire world, her teacher, her protector, her home. Now Mia was alone, completely, utterly alone. She placed the lilies against the headstone and felt the familiar sting of tears burning her eyes. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry today. She'd cried enough over the past year to fill an ocean. But grief didn't follow promises or schedules. It came when it wanted, crushing and relentless. The loneliness was the worst part. Mia had friends, co-workers, people who checked in on her occasionally, but none of them understood the hollow ache that lived in her chest. The way every day felt like walking through fog, never quite sure where she was going or why it mattered. Her grandmother had been her anchor, and without her, Mia felt adrift in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too cold. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the cemetery transformed. The warm amber light faded to a sickly gray, and the shadows deepened, pooling between the graves like dark water. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Mia pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The peaceful melancholy she'd felt moments ago shifted into something else, an unease that prickled the back of her neck. She wasn't alone anymore. Mia turned slowly, her heart already beginning to pound before she even knew why. That's when she saw her, an old woman standing about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the shadow of a massive oak tree. How long had she been there? Mia hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't sensed anyone approaching. It was as if the woman had simply materialized from the gathering darkness. The old woman was small and hunched, her frame so thin she seemed almost skeletal beneath her long black coat. Her face was deeply lined, carved with wrinkles that spoke of decades of hardship and sorrow. But it was her eyes that made Mia's breath catch. They were pale, almost colorless, and they stared at Mia with an intensity that felt like being pinned beneath a microscope. The woman moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, her movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge Mia with any warmth or friendliness. She simply approached, relentless and inevitable, until she stood close enough that Mia could see the deep hollows of her cheeks and smell the faint odor of decay that clung to her clothes. Mia's instincts screamed at her to move, to put distance between herself and this stranger. But grief had made her numb, and loneliness had made her desperate. So she stayed frozen, watching as the old woman reached into her coat pocket with gnarled, trembling fingers. When the woman's hand emerged, she was holding a silver ring. The ring was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, delicate silver filigree twisted into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the fading light. At its center sat a small black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a void that drew the eye and held it captive. The old woman extended the ring toward Mia, her pale eyes never leaving Mia's face. When she spoke, her voice was like dry leaves scraping across stone, brittle and ancient. She told Mia that she'd seen her here before, visiting the grave, drowning in sorrow. She said she understood that kind of grief, the kind that hollowed you out from the inside until you were nothing but a shell walking through the world. She explained that the ring was special, that it had the power to keep loved ones close, to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. She promised that if Mia wore it, she would never have to feel alone again. Every rational part of Mia's brain told her this was wrong. Strange old women didn't appear in cemeteries offering magical jewelry. This was the setup to a horror story, the kind of warning tale her grandmother used to tell her about being careful with strangers. The woman's hollow eyes, her corpse-like appearance, the unnatural stillness of her movements, everything about this encounter screamed danger. But grief does strange things to people. It makes them vulnerable, desperate, willing to believe in impossible things if it means easing the unbearable weight of loss. And Mia was so tired of being alone, so exhausted from carrying her sorrow like stones in her pockets, dragging her down with every step. The old woman continued to hold out the ring, patient and unmoving, as if she had all the time in the world. The black stone seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, calling to something deep inside Mia's chest. She found herself reaching out before she'd consciously decided to move, her hand extending toward the ring as if pulled by invisible threads. The moment Mia's fingers touched the silver band, a jolt of cold electricity shot through her arm. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was shocking, like plunging her hand into ice water. The ring was freezing, far colder than any metal should be on a warm October evening. But even as warning bells rang in her mind, Mia found herself slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, too perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her, sized to her exact measurements by someone who knew her intimately. The old woman's face transformed. What had been blank and expressionless suddenly split into a smile, but it was wrong, all wrong. The smile was too wide, revealing teeth that were too long and too gray. It was the smile of something that had forgotten how humans were supposed to look when they were happy, something that was only mimicking the gesture without understanding its meaning. The woman leaned closer, and Mia could see that her eyes weren't just pale, they were milky and dead, like the eyes of a fish that had been left too long in the sun. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming deeper and more resonant, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. She told Mia to wear the ring always, to never take it off. She said it would keep her grandmother close, closer than Mia could possibly imagine. And then, still smiling that horrible, too wide smile, the old woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between the graves as silently as she had appeared. Mia stood frozen, staring at the ring on her finger. The black stone gleamed in the dying light, and she could swear she saw something moving inside it, shadows that writhed and twisted like smoke trapped in glass. The silver band felt tight against her skin, almost constrictive, as if it were already beginning to merge with her flesh. What had she done? The question echoed in her mind as she finally tore her gaze away from the ring and looked around the cemetery. The old woman was gone, vanished completely. The sun had nearly set now, and the graveyard was drowning in shadows. The Spanish moss hanging from the trees looked less like funeral veils and more like grasping fingers, reaching down to pull the unwary into the earth below. Mia's heart was racing, adrenaline finally flooding her system now that the strange encounter was over. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this place before full darkness fell. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands and hurried toward the cemetery gates, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. But even as she walked, she couldn't stop glancing down at the ring. It seemed to grow heavier with each step, weighing down her hand like an anchor. And somewhere in the back of her mind, barely audible but definitely there, she thought she heard whispers, soft, insistent voices calling her name. Mia had just made the worst mistake of her life, but Mia had no idea that accepting the ring would unleash a terrifying chain of events that would challenge her very existence. Mia woke up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat despite the cold air conditioning in her apartment. The nightmare clung to her like cobwebs, images of grasping hands pulling her down into dark earth, of whispers in a language she didn't understand but somehow knew meant terrible things. She'd been drowning in soil, choking on dirt that tasted like rot and despair. while pale eyes watched her struggle from somewhere above. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and that's when she noticed it. The ring was still on her finger. That couldn't be right. Mia had a vague memory of trying to remove it before bed, of tugging at the silver band until her finger turned red and swollen. But here it was, gleaming in the early morning light, streaming through her bedroom window, the black stone at its center seeming to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. She grabbed the ring with her other hand and pulled. Nothing. The band wouldn't budge, wouldn't even rotate around her finger. It was as if it had fused with her skin overnight, becoming part of her body rather than an accessory she could remove at will. Panic rising in her throat, Mia pulled harder, twisting and yanking until tears pricked her eyes from the pain. The ring remained fixed in place, unmovable as a tattoo. The whispers started then so faint, she almost convinced herself she was imagining them. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, soft voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. Mia froze, straining to hear, but the moment she focused on them, they faded away like smoke. She told herself it was stress, lack of sleep, the lingering effects of grief, playing tricks on her mind. She had to get ready for work. Normal routine would help. Normal routine would make everything feel less insane. But nothing felt normal anymore. At her job as a graphic designer, Mia found herself unable to concentrate. Her coworkers' voices sounded distant and muffled, as if she were hearing them from underwater. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, making her head throb with each flicker. And the ring felt like it was growing tighter with each passing hour, constricting around her finger like a living thing. Worse were the cold spots. Throughout the day, Mia would suddenly be engulfed in pockets of frigid air that made her breath visible in misty clouds. Her coworkers didn't seem to notice, continuing their conversations in short sleeves, while Mia shivered violently, goosebumps covering her arms. The cold always came with the whispers, those barely audible voices that seemed to be calling her name, pulling at something deep inside her chest. By lunchtime, Mia knew she couldn't stay. She told her supervisor she was feeling ill, which wasn't a lie, and drove home in a daze. But her hands on the steering wheel seemed to have other ideas. Instead of turning toward her apartment, they guided the car south, toward the old part of the city, toward moss-covered trees and weathered stone. Toward the cemetery, Mia tried to fight it, tried to force the car in a different direction, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if invisible strings were attached to her limbs, pulling her inexorably back to Bonaventure. The ring pulsed against her finger in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were nearly drowning out her own thoughts. She found herself parking outside the cemetery gates, climbing out of her car like a sleepwalker, moving through the entrance with mechanical precision. The afternoon sun was bright overhead, but the cemetery seemed darker than it should be, shadows pooling between the graves despite the cloudless sky. Mia's feet carried her along familiar paths, past elaborate mausoleums and simple headstones, deeper into the oldest section of the graveyard. She wasn't consciously choosing her direction, but some part of her knew exactly where she was going. The ring was guiding her, pulling her towards something with the inevitability of gravity. She stopped in front of a grave she'd never noticed before, despite having visited this cemetery dozens of times over the past year. It was set slightly apart from the others, beneath a gnarled oak tree whose branches seemed to reach down like clawed fingers. The headstone was old, the engraving barely legible after decades of weathering. Eleanor Thorne, born 1901, died 1982. But what made Mia's blood run cold was the earth in front of the stone. It was freshly disturbed, dark and loose, as if it had been recently dug up and filled in again. That was impossible. Eleanor Thorne had died over 40 years ago. Why would her grave be freshly turned? Unless someone or something had been trying to get out. The whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all saying her name. Mia stumbled backward, pressing her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. The voices were inside her head, reverberating through her skull like screams in a cavern. And then, cutting through the chaos, one voice rose above the others. It was the old woman's voice, that dry leaves rasp that Mia recognized from the previous evening. The voice told her not to be afraid, that they were connected now, bound together by the ring. It explained that Eleanor had been alone for so long, trapped between worlds, unable to move on because no one remembered her. No one mourned her. No one kept her company in the endless darkness. The voice said that Mia would never be alone again. They would be together forever. Mia ran. She tore herself away from the grave and sprinted through the cemetery, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her vision blurring with tears. The voices followed her, echoing off the headstones, seeming to come from the earth itself. She could feel Eleanor's presence like a weight on her shoulders, like cold hands wrapped around her throat. When she finally reached her car, Mia collapsed against the driver's side door, fumbling with her keys with shaking hands. She had to get the ring off, had to break this connection before it consumed her completely. She grabbed the silver band and pulled with all her strength, ignoring the pain as her finger swelled and turned purple. The ring didn't move. She tried soap, lotion, ice, nothing worked. The band remained fixed in place, and the black stone seemed to pulse with satisfaction at her futile efforts. That night, the nightmares intensified. Mia dreamed she was Eleanor Thorne, living through the old woman's life in vivid, horrifying detail. She saw Eleanor as a young woman, beautiful and full of hope, falling in love with a man who promised her the world. She felt Eleanor's heartbreak when he abandoned her, leaving her pregnant and alone in an era that showed no mercy to unwed mothers. She experienced Eleanor's shame as her family disowned her, as her friends turned away, as she lost her child to illness and poverty. She lived through decades of Eleanor's isolation, watching the old woman grow bitter and twisted, her heart hardening like stone as year after year passed without love, without companionship, without anyone who cared whether she lived or died. She felt Eleanor's rage as she lay dying in a charity hospital, surrounded by strangers, knowing she would be buried in a pauper's grave with no one to mourn her. And she understood, with terrible clarity, that Eleanor had cursed herself in those final moments. She had refused to let go, refused to accept death, because death meant being alone forever. So she had bound herself to the ring, turning it into a trap, a tether that would allow her to pull someone else into her eternal isolation. Mia woke up screaming, her voice raw and broken. The ring burned against her finger like a brand, searing her flesh with supernatural heat. She looked down and saw that her skin around the band had turned gray and cold, as if the life was being drained from her body starting at the point of contact. She was being consumed. Slowly, inexorably, Eleanor was pulling her into death, into that space between worlds, where the old woman had been trapped for over 40 years. And unless Mia found a way to break the connection, she would become exactly what Eleanor wanted, a companion in eternal darkness, another lost soul wandering the cemetery, never able to rest, never able to move on. But Mia was about to discover that her connection to the old woman was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. 3 days had passed since Mia's last visit to the cemetery, and she was dying. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that grief kills slowly. She was actually, physically dying, and she could feel it happening with every breath she took. The gray discoloration had spread from her ring finger up her entire hand, creeping past her wrist and halfway up her forearm like frost crawling across a window. Her skin was cold to the touch, corpse cold, and when she pressed her fingers against her neck to check her pulse, she could barely feel it, a faint, irregular flutter that seemed to grow weaker by the hour. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Food turned to ash in her mouth, and the thought of consuming anything made her stomach churn with revulsion. Water tasted like grave dirt. Sleep brought only nightmares, endless visions of Eleanor's life, her loneliness, her desperate, clawing need for connection that had followed her beyond death. Mia had stopped going to work. She'd stopped answering her phone. She'd pulled away from everyone she knew because she couldn't bear to let them see what she was becoming. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back hollow-eyed and gaunt, her cheeks sunken, her lips tinged with blue. She looked like someone who had been dead for days but hadn't yet realized it. The whispers never stopped now. Eleanor's voice was a constant presence in her mind, sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, always there. The old woman begged Mia not to fight, promised that letting go would be easier, insisted that they could be together forever in the peaceful darkness. But Mia had seen that darkness in her dreams, had felt the suffocating weight of Eleanor's isolation, and she knew there was nothing peaceful about it. She had tried everything to remove the ring, She'd gone to jewelers who claimed they could cut through any metal, but their tools broke against the silver band as if it were made of diamond. She'd visited a hospital emergency room, where a doctor had attempted to use a ring cutter, only to have the device spark and shatter, sending shrapnel across the room. The doctor had looked at Mia with undisguised fear and told her there was nothing more he could do. She'd even considered more drastic measures, amputation, cutting off her own finger to escape the curse. But she knew, with the terrible certainty that came from her connection to Eleanor, that it wouldn't work. The ring wasn't just on her finger anymore. It was inside her, woven into her soul, binding her to the old woman with threads that couldn't be severed by any physical means. There was only one option left. She had to go back to the cemetery. She had to confront Eleanor directly and find a way to break the curse at its source, or die trying. On the fourth morning, as weak sunlight filtered through her apartment windows, Mia forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her weight, and she had to grip the edge of her dresser to keep from collapsing. She looked at her reflection one more time and barely recognized the specter staring back. This was what Eleanor wanted to drag Mia down into death, to have a companion in her eternal prison. But Mia wasn't dead yet, and as long as she still had breath in her lungs, she would fight. The drive to Bonaventure Cemetery felt like a funeral procession. Mia's hands on the steering wheel were gray and skeletal, the veins standing out like dark rivers beneath translucent skin. Every movement required tremendous effort, as if she were moving through water, as if gravity had doubled its pull on her body. The ring pulsed with each heartbeat, and she could feel Eleanor's anticipation building, a sick excitement radiating from the black stone. The old woman knew Mia was coming. She was waiting. The cemetery looked different in the harsh light of late morning. The romantic melancholy that had drawn Mia here on the anniversary of her grandmother's death was gone, replaced by something stark and unforgiving. The headstones looked like broken teeth jutting from the earth. The Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees resembled funeral shrouds. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place, leaving it wrapped in an unnatural silence. Mia walked through the gates with the slow, measured steps of someone approaching their own execution. Her body knew where to go without conscious direction, pulled by the invisible tether connecting her to Eleanor's grave. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more coherent, until they resolved into Eleanor's voice speaking clearly in her mind. The old woman welcomed her back, told her she'd been waiting, said she knew Mia would return eventually. Everyone always came back. The ring made sure of that. Mia reached Eleanor's grave beneath the gnarled oak tree and collapsed to her knees in front of the freshly turned earth. Up close, she could see that the soil wasn't just disturbed, it was wrong. Nothing grew here. No grass, no weeds, not even moss. The earth was barren and dark, as if the ground itself had been poisoned by whatever lay beneath. She pressed her gray hands against the dirt and felt a jolt of connection, like completing an electrical circuit. Suddenly, she wasn't just hearing Eleanor's voice, she was experiencing Eleanor's memories directly, living through them as if they were her own. She saw Eleanor as a girl of 17, full of dreams and innocence, falling desperately in love with a man named Thomas who promised her marriage and respectability. She felt the joy of their secret meetings, the thrill of forbidden romance, the certainty that they would build a life together. Then came the betrayal. Thomas's family arranged his marriage to someone more suitable, someone with money and connections. He abandoned Eleanor without a word, leaving her pregnant and ruined. In 1918, an unmarried pregnant woman was a scandal, a shame that could destroy entire families. Mia experienced Eleanor's terror as she tried to hide her condition, her desperation as her family discovered the truth and cast her out, calling her a whore and a disgrace. She felt the physical agony of giving birth alone in a charity ward, and the soul-crushing grief when her baby daughter died 3 days later from an infection that could have been prevented with proper medical care. The memories came faster now, decades compressing into moments. Eleanor working menial jobs, living in boarding houses, watching other women marry and have families while she remained alone. The years hardened her, turned her bitter and cold. She stopped trying to connect with people, stopped hoping for companionship, built walls around her heart that nothing could penetrate. By the time Eleanor was old, she had perfected her isolation. She had no friends, no family, no one who cared whether she lived or died. When she finally collapsed in her tiny apartment at the age of 81, it took 3 weeks for anyone to notice. By then, her body had begun to decompose. Mia felt Eleanor's final moments lying on a hospital bed in the charity ward, the same place her daughter had died 64 years earlier. The nurses treated her like an inconvenience, a burden on the system. No one held her hand. No one whispered comforting words. She died alone, just as she had lived, and the rage and loneliness that had consumed her entire life crystallized in that final moment into something dark and powerful. Eleanor had refused to accept it, refused to move on to whatever came next. She had cursed herself to remain, to linger in the space between life and death, and she had bound that curse to the silver ring, the only piece of jewelry she'd ever owned, a cheap trinket she'd bought for herself decades ago because no one else would ever give her anything beautiful. The ring became her anchor, her trap, her way of ensuring she would never be alone again. She would offer it to the grieving, to the lonely, to anyone desperate enough to accept it. And once they did, she would pull them down into her darkness, slowly draining their life force until they joined her in that terrible liminal space where she was trapped. Mia had been her latest victim, but she wouldn't be the last. Eleanor had done this before dozens of times over the decades since her death. Young women, old men, children even, anyone who came to the cemetery, drowning in grief, she would appear to them, offer them the ring, promise them connection. And one by one, they would disappear, their deaths ruled as suicides or accidents, their bodies eventually found in the cemetery with no explanation for how they'd died. The truth crashed over Mia like a wave of ice water. She wasn't just fighting for her own life, she was fighting to prevent Eleanor from claiming more victims. The old woman was a predator, a monster created by loneliness and bitterness, and she would never stop hunting as long as the curse remained unbroken. Mia pulled her hands away from the earth and stared at the ring on her finger. The black stone was glowing now, pulsing with malevolent energy. She could feel Eleanor's presence coalescing around her, the air growing thick and cold, shadows gathering despite the bright morning sun. The old woman's voice filled her mind, no longer pleading but demanding. Eleanor told her to stop resisting, to accept her fate, to embrace the peace of letting go. She said that Mia was already too far gone, that the transformation was nearly complete. In another day, maybe two, Mia's heart would stop beating, and her soul would be pulled into the darkness with Eleanor. They would be together forever, just as the old woman had always wanted. But Eleanor also revealed something else, something she hadn't intended to share. In her desperation to keep Mia from escaping, the old woman let slip a crucial piece of information. The curse could be broken, but only through an act of genuine compassion, something Eleanor herself had never experienced and couldn't understand. The ring fed on isolation and bitterness. It grew stronger when its victims fought alone, when they let fear and desperation consume them. But if someone could face Eleanor with forgiveness instead of hatred, with empathy instead of anger, the curse might shatter. It was a nearly impossible task. How could anyone feel compassion for a monster who was actively trying to kill them? How could Mia forgive someone who had ruined so many lives out of selfish need? But as she knelt there in front of Eleanor's grave, feeling her own life slipping away, Mia understood something profound. Eleanor wasn't a monster. She was a victim of her time, of circumstances, of a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty and rejection. The curse she'd created was just the final expression of a lifetime of pain. That didn't excuse what Eleanor had done. It didn't make her innocent, but it meant there might be another way to end this, besides violence or hatred. Mia looked down at her gray, dying hands and made a decision. She would return one more time. She would face Eleanor directly, not with weapons or anger, but with the one thing the old woman had never received in life or death: genuine human compassion. It might kill her, probably would kill her, but it was the only chance she had. But what she uncovered would force Mia to make an unimaginable choice: to embrace the darkness or risk losing herself forever. Mia returned to Bonaventure Cemetery as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing herself, not with weapons or protective charms, but with acceptance. Acceptance of what Eleanor had been, what she had become, and what Mia herself might have to sacrifice to end this nightmare. She was so weak now that walking required every ounce of willpower she possessed. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unresponsive. The gray discoloration had spread across her chest, creeping toward her heart like frost claiming a window pane. She could see the dark veins beneath her skin, mapping the curse's progress through her body. By her own estimation, she had perhaps 12 hours left before her heart stopped beating entirely. 12 hours to break a curse that had existed for over 40 years. 12 hours to save her own life and prevent Eleanor from claiming future victims. The cemetery gates stood open like the mouth of some great beast, and Mia walked through them without hesitation. Night fell quickly in Savannah, and by the time she reached the older section of the graveyard, darkness had swallowed everything. The moon was a thin crescent, providing almost no light, and the shadows between the headstones seemed to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent life. Mia didn't need light to find her way. The ring pulled her forward with inexorable force, dragging her toward Eleanor's grave like a fish being reeled in by an invisible line. The black stone blazed with supernatural fire, casting an eerie glow that made her gray skin look even more corpse-like. Eleanor was waiting for her. Mia felt the old woman's presence before she saw her, a pocket of cold, so intense it made the mild October evening feel like the depths of winter. Her breath came out in white clouds, and ice crystals began forming on the nearby headstones. The temperature continued to drop, and Mia's already weakened body started to shake violently. Then Eleanor appeared. She didn't materialize gradually or fade into view like ghosts in movies. One moment there was empty air, and the next, she was there standing in front of her grave with that same black coat and those same pale, dead eyes. But this time, she wasn't trying to hide what she was. This time, Mia could see her true form. Eleanor's flesh was gray and rotted, hanging from her bones in strips. Her fingers were skeletal, the nails long and yellow. Her eyes were sunken deep into her skull, glowing with a faint, sickly light. When she opened her mouth, Mia could see that her teeth were broken and stained, and her breath smelled like grave dirt and decay. This was what Eleanor had become, not just a ghost, but something twisted and wrong, a spirit so consumed by bitterness and loneliness that she had transformed into a monster. The old woman's voice filled the air, no longer just in Mia's mind but echoing through the cemetery like wind through a canyon. She told Mia she was glad she'd returned, that she'd known she would come back. They all came back eventually. The ring made sure of it. Eleanor moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, and Mia forced herself to stand her ground even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The ghost circled her slowly, examining her with those hollow, glowing eyes, and Mia could feel Eleanor's satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a furnace. The old woman commented on how well the transformation was progressing, how Mia's life force was almost completely drained. Soon, Eleanor said, Mia would cross over completely, and they would be together forever. No more loneliness, no more isolation, just the two of them, bound together for eternity. Mia felt the pull, then a terrible, seductive urge to simply give in, to stop fighting and let the darkness take her. It would be so easy. The pain would stop, the fear would end. She could rest, finally rest, after carrying the weight of grief and loss for so long. But then she thought of her grandmother, of Margaret Chen, who had raised her with love and strength, who had taught her to face difficulties with courage rather than surrender. Her grandmother hadn't given up when Mia's parents died. She hadn't let grief consume her. She had chosen to keep living, to keep loving, to keep fighting. Mia would honor that legacy. She would not become another victim of Eleanor's curse. She spoke then, her voice weak but steady, telling Eleanor that she understood her pain. She acknowledged the terrible loneliness the old woman had endured, the cruelty and rejection she'd faced, the unbearable weight of dying alone and unmourned. Mia said she was genuinely sorry for what Eleanor had suffered, that no one deserved to experience such isolation and abandonment. Eleanor's form flickered, surprise registering on her decayed features. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. Her previous victims had begged, pleaded, screamed in terror, but none had offered her compassion. Encouraged, Mia continued. She told Eleanor that she understood why the old woman had created the curse. Why? She'd bound herself to the ring and trapped herself between worlds. When you've been hurt so deeply for so long, it becomes impossible to imagine any other existence. Loneliness becomes an identity, and the thought of facing eternity alone is more terrifying than remaining in limbo forever. But Mia also told Eleanor something the old woman didn't want to hear, that the curse hadn't solved anything. It hadn't ended her loneliness. It had only spread it, infecting others with the same isolation and despair that had consumed Eleanor in life. Every person she'd pulled into darkness had been someone who was already suffering, already grieving, already vulnerable. Eleanor had become the very thing that had destroyed her, a source of cruelty and pain. The ghost's expression transformed. The flicker of surprise hardened into rage, and her form began to change, growing larger and more monstrous. Her jaw unhinged, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. Her fingers elongated into claws. Her eyes blazed with fury and desperation. Eleanor's voice became a shriek that made the ground tremble. She screamed that Mia knew nothing, understood nothing. She raged that Mia had no right to judge her, no right to pity her. She'd suffered for decades, endured pain that would have broken anyone else. And she deserved companionship. She deserved not to be alone anymore. The old woman lunged forward, and Mia felt spectral hands wrap around her throat. The touch was ice cold and burned like acid, and suddenly Mia couldn't breathe. Eleanor's face was inches from hers, twisted with rage and anguish, and Mia could feel the ghost trying to pull her soul from her body, trying to drag her consciousness into that dark space between life and death. The ring on Mia's finger erupted with black fire. The pain was indescribable, like her hand was being consumed from the inside out. She could feel her soul beginning to tear loose, feel herself being pulled toward Eleanor's realm of eternal isolation. But Mia didn't fight back with anger or hatred. Instead, even as she choked and burned, she forced herself to look into Eleanor's eyes and speak words she could barely believe she was saying. She told Eleanor that she forgave her. She forgave her for the curse, for the manipulation, for trying to steal her life. She forgave her because Eleanor was a victim too, a victim of circumstances, of an unforgiving world, of her own inability to let go of pain. Mia said that Eleanor deserved peace, deserved to be released from the prison she'd built for herself. She deserved to move on to whatever came next, to finally be free of the loneliness that had defined her entire existence. And then Mia said something that made Eleanor's grip falter. She told the old woman that she would remember her. She would honor Eleanor's memory, would make sure her story was told, would ensure that she wasn't forgotten. Eleanor wouldn't die a second time in obscurity. Her life, her suffering, her existence would matter. But Mia would not become her prisoner. She would not sacrifice her own life to ease Eleanor's loneliness. That wasn't compassion, it was enabling, allowing the cycle of pain to continue indefinitely. Eleanor's monstrous form wavered, the rage in her eyes mixing with something else, confusion, hope, fear. No one had ever offered to remember her before. No one had ever suggested that her life had meaning beyond her suffering. But the curse was too strong, too deeply rooted in decades of bitterness and pain. Eleanor might have wanted to let go, might have been moved by Mia's words, but the dark magic she'd created had taken on a life of its own. The ring continued to burn, continued to pull at Mia's soul, and Eleanor's hands remained locked around her throat. Mia felt herself dying. Her vision was going dark at the edges, her lungs screaming for air, her heart stuttering in her chest. The gray discoloration had reached her face, and she could feel her life force draining away like water through a sieve. In desperation, she reached up with her free hand, the one not bearing the cursed ring, and placed it gently against Eleanor's decayed cheek. The touch burned both of them, living flesh against spectral form, but Mia didn't pull away. She told Eleanor one final thing, her voice barely a whisper, that it was okay to let go. That holding on to pain didn't honor the people we'd lost or the suffering we'd endured. That true peace came from releasing bitterness, from choosing forgiveness over revenge, from accepting that some wounds would never fully heal but didn't have to define us forever. She told Eleanor that she could rest now, that she didn't have to be alone anymore, because Mia would carry her memory forward. And that was a kind of companionship too, being remembered, being honored, being acknowledged as someone whose life had mattered. Eleanor's grip loosened. Her monstrous form began to shrink, reverting to the small, hunched old woman Mia had first encountered. Tears streamed down her decayed face, and for the first time in over 40 years, Eleanor Thorne allowed herself to feel something other than rage and loneliness. She felt hope, but the battle was far from over. Mia's declaration would unleash a storm of emotions that would test her resolve and determine the fate of both their souls. For a moment, the cemetery held its breath. Eleanor's spirit stood frozen, tears streaming down her decayed face, her spectral hands still hovering near Mia's throat. The black fire from the cursed ring flickered and dimmed, as if the dark magic itself was uncertain how to proceed. Mia could feel the old woman's internal struggle, decades of bitterness and rage warring against the fragile hope that Mia's words had kindled in her long-dead heart. Then, the moment shattered. Eleanor's face contorted with renewed fury, her features twisting into something inhuman and terrible. The brief flicker of hope vanished, consumed by the overwhelming fear of being alone again. She had been offered peace, but peace meant letting go, and letting go meant returning to that terrifying solitude she'd endured in her final moments. The prospect was too horrifying. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. The old woman's spirit exploded with supernatural rage, her form expanding until she towered over Mia like a nightmare given shape. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing a void of absolute darkness, and from that void came a scream that shook the very foundations of the earth. Headstones cracked, tree branches snapped, the ground beneath Mia's feet split and buckled. Eleanor lunged forward with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her spectral claws extended, her eyes blazing with desperate madness. She shrieked that Mia had lied to her, had offered false hope just like everyone else in her miserable life. She screamed that she would take what she was owed, that Mia's soul would be hers whether she offered it willingly or not. Mia tried to dodge, but her weakened body betrayed her. She stumbled and fell backward, landing hard on the cold earth. Eleanor was on her in an instant, spectral weight pressing down on her chest, crushing the air from her lungs. The ghost's hands plunged into Mia's torso, reaching not for flesh but for something deeper, something essential. She was reaching for Mia's soul. The pain was beyond anything Mia had ever experienced. It felt like she was being turned inside out, like every nerve in her body was on fire while simultaneously being frozen in ice. She could feel Eleanor's consciousness invading hers, could feel the old woman's memories and emotions flooding into her mind like poison. The loneliness was overwhelming, a crushing weight of decades of isolation that threatened to drown Mia's own sense of self. The ring on Mia's finger blazed with renewed power, the black stone pulsing like a diseased heart. The silver band constricted, cutting into her flesh, drawing blood that steamed and hissed as it touched the cursed metal. Mia could feel the ring burrowing deeper, fusing with her bone, becoming an inseparable part of her body. In minutes, maybe seconds, the transformation would be complete. She would die, and her soul would be trapped with Eleanor's in that terrible space between life and death. But something else was happening too. The supernatural conflict between Mia and Eleanor was sending shockwaves through the cemetery, disturbing things that had long been at rest. All around them, the air began to shimmer and distort. Other spirits were awakening, drawn to the massive release of dark energy like moths to a flame. Translucent figures began to materialize between the headstones, dozens of them, then hundreds. Some were merely shadows, barely visible impressions of people who had once been. Others were more solid, more present, their features clear enough to see the confusion and fear on their spectral faces. They were the dead of Bonaventure Cemetery, souls who had been resting peacefully until Eleanor's rage had torn through the veil, separating their world from the living. But among them were other spirits that looked wrong, twisted, corrupted. These were Eleanor's previous victims, the souls she had claimed over the decades, trapped in the same liminal space as their captor. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal suffering. Some reached toward Mia with pleading gestures, as if begging her to free them. Others seemed to want to help Eleanor, to drag Mia down into their shared prison so they wouldn't be alone anymore. The cemetery had become a battleground between the living and the dead, and Mia was at the center of it all. Eleanor's spirit pressed harder, her spectral hands sinking deeper into Mia's chest. The old woman was crying now, tears of rage and desperation streaming down her decayed face. She begged Mia to stop fighting, to accept her fate, to understand that this was the only way. She couldn't be alone anymore. She couldn't face eternity in isolation. She needed Mia. She needed someone, anyone, to share the endless darkness with her. And in that moment, despite the pain, despite the terror, despite being seconds from death, Mia felt something unexpected, genuine sorrow for Eleanor Thorne. This was what loneliness did to people. It twisted them, corrupted them, turned them into monsters who would hurt others just to ease their own suffering. Eleanor had been a victim once, but her refusal to heal, her choice to cling to bitterness and pain, had transformed her into a predator. She had become the very thing that had destroyed her, a source of cruelty and isolation. But it didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to end with both of them trapped forever. Mia made her decision. She stopped fighting Eleanor's pull, and instead focused all her remaining strength on her right hand, the hand bearing the cursed ring. The silver band had fused with her flesh, burrowing so deep it had become part of her bone structure. Removing it would require tearing it from her body, ripping away skin and muscle, and possibly shattering her finger entirely. But it was the only way. Mia reached across her body with her left hand and grabbed the ring. The moment her fingers touched the cursed metal, agony exploded through her arm. The ring didn't want to be removed. It fought back with every ounce of dark magic Eleanor had poured into it over 4 decades. Black fire erupted from the stone, consuming Mia's left hand, burning through flesh and exposing bone. She screamed, but she didn't let go. Eleanor realized what Mia was trying to do and shrieked in fury. The old woman's spirit became fully monstrous again, her jaw unhinging, her eyes blazing with hellfire. She pressed down harder, her spectral claws digging deeper into Mia's chest, reaching for her heart, for the core of her life force. But Mia had made peace with what she had to do. Even if it killed her, even if removing the ring meant her death, she would not let Eleanor claim another victim. She would not let this cycle of suffering continue. She pulled. The pain was indescribable. The ring came away slowly, reluctantly, taking layers of skin and muscle with it. Blood poured from Mia's finger, black and steaming, corrupted by the curse. She could feel her finger breaking, the bone splintering, but she didn't stop. She pulled harder, screaming through clenched teeth, her vision going white with agony. The spirits surrounding them began to react. The twisted, corrupted souls Eleanor's previous victims started to wail, a sound of such profound sorrow that it seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. They could sense what was happening, could feel the curse beginning to unravel. Some reached toward Mia with desperate hope, while others tried to stop her, their spectral hands grasping at her arms and legs. Eleanor's spirit flickered and distorted, her connection to the physical world weakening as Mia continued to remove the ring. The old woman screamed that Mia couldn't do this, that she had no right, that they were supposed to be together forever. But beneath the rage, Mia could hear something else: terror. Eleanor was terrified of what came next, terrified of facing whatever lay beyond without the anchor of the curse to keep her tethered to the world. With one final, desperate pull, Mia tore the ring completely from her finger. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The black fire consuming Mia's hand suddenly reversed direction, flowing back into the ring. Eleanor's spirit was yanked backward, as if pulled by invisible chains, her spectral form stretching and distorting. The cursed souls surrounding them began to glow with pale light, their corrupted forms slowly reverting to something more peaceful, more human. Mia collapsed onto her back, gasping for air, her right hand a mangled ruin. Blood pooled beneath her, and she could feel her consciousness beginning to slip away. But she wasn't done yet. She had to finish this. With the last of her strength, Mia crawled toward Eleanor's grave. Every movement was agony. Her body was shutting down, her heart struggling to beat, her lungs barely able to draw breath. But she forced herself forward, inch by agonizing inch, until she reached the freshly turned earth. Eleanor's spirit hovered above the grave, flickering between her monstrous form and the small, frightened old woman she had been in life. She begged Mia not to do this, pleaded with her to put the ring back on, promised she would be gentler, kinder, if only Mia would give her another chance. But Mia knew there could be no second chances. The curse had to end here, tonight, or it would continue claiming victims for decades more. She placed the ring on top of the grave, pressing it into the dark soil with her mangled, bleeding hand. As soon as the cursed metal touched the earth, the Ground began to glow with pale blue light. The light spread outward in ripples, washing over the surrounding headstones, touching the spirits that had gathered to witness this final confrontation. Mia looked up at Eleanor's flickering form and spoke, her voice barely a whisper but carrying weight that seemed to resonate through the entire cemetery. She told Eleanor that she was releasing her from the curse, freeing her from the prison she had built for herself. She said that Eleanor's suffering was over, that she could finally rest, finally be at peace. But Mia also told her something else, something that Eleanor needed to hear more than anything. She told the old woman that her life had mattered, that her suffering, while terrible, had taught Mia something important about the danger of letting loneliness consume you, about the necessity of forgiveness and letting go. Eleanor's story would be remembered, would be told, would serve as a reminder that isolation could destroy a person, as surely as any disease. She would not be forgotten. She would not die a second time in obscurity. Eleanor's spirit stopped flickering. Her monstrous form melted away completely, leaving only the small, hunched old woman Mia had first encountered. The rage drained from her face, replaced by something Mia hadn't seen before: peace, understanding, acceptance. The old woman looked down at Mia with eyes that were no longer pale and dead, but clear and almost human. She told Mia she was sorry, her voice soft and filled with genuine remorse. She said she had been so afraid of being alone that she had become the very thing she feared: isolated, cut off from compassion and connection by her own bitterness and rage. Eleanor's spirit began to glow with the same pale blue light emanating from the grave. She looked around at the other spirits gathered in the cemetery, the peaceful dead and her own corrupted victims, and Mia saw understanding dawn on her spectral face. By releasing Eleanor, Mia had also freed all the souls the old woman had claimed over the decades. They were all being given a second chance, an opportunity to move on to whatever came next. Eleanor looked back at Mia one final time and spoke words of gratitude. She thanked Mia for seeing past the monster she had become to the frightened, wounded woman underneath. She thanked her for offering compassion when she deserved only condemnation. And she thanked her for the greatest gift of all, the promise that she would be remembered. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry decades of pent-up sorrow and relief, Eleanor Thorne let go. Her spirit dissolved into light, rising up from the grave like smoke, like mist, like a soul finally freed from its earthly prison. The other corrupted spirits followed, their twisted forms reverting to peaceful human shapes before they too dissipated into light and vanished. The pale blue glow spread throughout the entire cemetery, washing over every headstone, every grave, every shadowed corner, cleansing the space of the dark energy that had accumulated there over decades. The ring on Eleanor's grave crumbled to dust, the curse finally broken, the dark magic dispersed. The black stone at its center cracked and shattered, releasing one final pulse of energy before going dark forever. And then it was over. The cemetery fell silent. The spirits were gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a peaceful stillness. Even the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees seemed to sway more gently, as if the entire graveyard had taken a deep, relieved breath. Mia lay on the ground beside Eleanor's grave, barely conscious, her body broken and bleeding. The gray discoloration was already beginning to fade from her skin, color slowly returning to her face and hands. Her mangled finger throbbed with pain, but it was clean pain, natural pain, not the corrupted agony of the curse. She had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, she had survived. As the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mia forced herself to stand. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she managed to get to her feet, swaying but upright. She looked down at Eleanor's grave one final time and made a silent promise to honor the old woman's memory, to tell her story, to ensure that her suffering served some purpose beyond pain. Then Mia turned and began the long walk toward the cemetery gates. Each step was difficult, each movement requiring tremendous effort, but she kept going. Behind her, the sun continued to rise, flooding the cemetery with warm light, banishing the shadows that had seemed so menacing just hours before. By the time Mia reached her car, she was exhausted but alive. She was changed, marked forever by her encounter with Eleanor Thorne, carrying scars both physical and emotional that would never fully heal. But she was free. The curse was broken. The cycle of suffering had ended. As she drove away from Bonaventure Cemetery, Mia glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the sun fully risen, its light transforming the graveyard from a place of darkness and sorrow into something peaceful and almost beautiful. Somewhere in that light, she hoped, Eleanor Thorne had finally found the rest she'd been denied for so long. Mia had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. She had offered compassion to a monster and freed a tortured soul. And though she would carry the weight of that experience for the rest of her life, she knew she had done something important, something meaningful. She had broken the curse, she had survived, and she would make sure Eleanor's story was never forgotten. 3 months later, Mia returned to Bonaventure Cemetery. This time, she came in bright daylight. On a crisp December afternoon when the winter sun cast long shadows across the graves but held no menace, she carried a small bouquet of white roses and a simple stone marker she'd had commissioned. Her right hand still bore the scars from that terrible night, a twisted mass of scar tissue where the ring had fused with her flesh, a permanent reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. The doctors had been amazed she'd kept the finger at all, though it would never fully function again. Mia didn't mind. The scar was a badge of honor, proof that she had survived something that should have killed her. She made her way through the familiar paths to Eleanor's grave. The dark, barren earth had transformed in the months since the curse was broken. Grass now grew there, soft and green, and small wildflowers had begun to bloom despite the winter cold. It was as if the ground itself was healing, recovering from decades of corruption. Mia knelt beside the grave and placed the white roses on the freshly grown grass. Then she carefully positioned the stone marker she'd brought, a simple granite plaque engraved with Eleanor's name, her dates of birth and death, and a single line beneath, "Her story will not be forgotten." As she worked, Mia spoke softly, telling Eleanor about the article she'd written documenting the old woman's life and the curse that had consumed her. She'd researched Eleanor's history thoroughly, tracking down records of her birth, her brief romance with Thomas, the daughter who had died so young. She'd pieced together a complete picture of a life defined by tragedy and isolation. And she'd shared that story with the world, not as a cautionary tale or a ghost story, but as a reminder of the importance of compassion and connection. The article had resonated with people in ways Mia hadn't expected. She'd received hundreds of letters from readers who had experienced similar loneliness, who had felt themselves becoming bitter and isolated, who had recognized Eleanor's story as a reflection of their own struggles. Many had reached out for help, seeking therapy or reconnecting with estranged family members, determined not to let loneliness consume them the way it had consumed Eleanor Thorne. In death, Eleanor had finally achieved what she'd been denied in life. Her story had mattered. Her suffering had meaning. She had touched lives and made a difference, even if she would never know it. Mia finished positioning the marker and sat back, her scarred hand resting on the cool grass. The cemetery was peaceful now, truly peaceful, in a way it hadn't been during her previous visits. She could feel the difference, the absence of that oppressive, watchful presence that had haunted this place for so long. Eleanor was gone. She had moved on, and Mia hoped, wherever the old woman's soul had ended up, she had finally found the peace and companionship she'd so desperately sought. As Mia stood to leave, a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. Mia smiled, touched her scarred hand to her heart in a gesture of farewell, and walked away from Eleanor Thorne's grave for the last time. She had kept her promise. Eleanor's story would not be forgotten, and in remembering, in honoring the tragedy of a life consumed by loneliness, Mia had ensured that Eleanor's suffering had not been in vain. The curse was broken, the dead were at rest, and Mia Chen, forever changed by her encounter with the supernatural, walked out of Bonaventure Cemetery and into the rest of her life scarred but stronger, haunted but free.